World War II went extremely well for Germany in the beginning. They were able to defeat France in a number of weeks. They conquered Norway, Belgium, Holland, Greece, Yugoslavia. Every time they encountered the British Army, they defeated it or were able to drive it back. By 1941, they had decided that the time was right to invade Russia and fulfill Hitler's pledge of bringing living space to the German people. And again, that invasion seemed to go incredibly well. The Russian Air Force was destroyed almost immediately when the Germans invaded that summer. They surrounded huge numbers of Russian soldiers. But by the winter, and a particularly cold and cruel winter, which the German army had not been prepared for, things began to fall apart. The Germans failed to capture Moscow, the Russian capital, which if they had taken, they could have maybe forced the Russians to negotiate a surrender. They also failed to destroy the Russian army. The Russian army was not completely decimated or completely destroyed by the Germans, and that meant that the Russians could call on huge reserves of manpower, millions of people living in the Russian Empire, to come forward and replace the soldiers who had been lost. And to make matters worse, the Americans joined the war against Germany in December of 1941. And the Americans had a massive military-industrial complex they could call on. The American army was very small at that stage, practically non-existent, but it was able to rearm very quickly. And from that point onwards, Germany struggled in the war. It was fighting on two fronts. It was fighting against two massive powers, Russia and America. And it was very difficult to see a clear path to victory. The Americans initially wanted to invade France very quickly and attack America on both sides, but the British persuaded them that this would be an extremely bad idea. Launching a fleet across the English Channel would be a difficult operation, and the American army was inexperienced. The Americans and the British fought Germany in North Africa so that the Americans could gain some vital experience, but it was important to show the Russians that America and Britain were committed to winning the war. So the British and the Americans came up with the idea of an air campaign against Germany. They sent over thousands of bombers in massive raids to pound German cities to the ground. Now, some American strategists actually thought that America could win the war this way, that this was a possible path to victory. And the idea was that precision bombing would allow Americans flying during the daytime to bomb German factories accurately. The British, under General Bomber Harris, realised that this was not likely to work. They realised that bombs were still extremely inaccurate, and it was very difficult to hit a factory from thousands of feet high in the air. The British eventually won the Americans over to the strategy of bombing American cities. You would use the city as a target. The British launched night raids rather than flying during daytime. The Americans continued to attack during the day, and what that meant is that Germany was being pounded 24 hours a day by Allied bombers. The British tactics became more and more ruthless. The British realised that you couldn't hit a factory from the air, particularly at night, but what you could do was pound the factory workers. If you hit their homes and destroyed their homes, you would drive them out of the city, and that would mean that the factory could not operate. Now, again, the British were a bit too optimistic about this. Yes, people would be driven out of the city to stay outside the city in the hills and in shelters that were built by the German government. But very, very quickly, the Germans could rebuild and could get people back to the factories and get the factories operational again. The idea was to drive the Germans to the point of surrender, and again, this was extremely unlikely to happen. The British hadn't surrendered when the Germans had bombed their cities in 1940 during the Blitz and through into 1941. As a matter of fact, bombing seemed to make the British more determined to fight. And Germany was a police state. There was no free press. The Germans were spying on their own people. So the idea of a rebellion against the Germans, against the German government by the German people, was just completely unrealistic. However, that didn't stop the British from trying. And if you look at the charts on the PowerPoint in front of you, you can see that in Hamburg in 1943, there was a devastating raid in which 20,000 people died. There was a similar one in 1944 in Dresden. In Hamburg, it was a particularly vicious bombing. It was the firebombing of Hamburg, and what the British used were incendiary devices. They used flames, the bombs that would burst into flames, and they bombed in concentric circles. They bombed a circle around the outside of the city to prevent people escaping, and then the next row of bombers would bomb the inside that circle, and then closer and closer into the inside of the city, meaning that people couldn't escape. The flames were so fierce that it sucked air out of air raid shelters and people suffocated to death. People were literally lifted off the ground and sucked into the flames. So that caused 20,000 deaths in 1943. The British never really tried anything on that scale again until they bombed Dresden in 1944. Because of the reaction against it, the Germans used it as a reason to fight these barbaric British. The air war did have some effect on the war. It meant that the Germans had to pull planes back away from the Russian front to defend cities. It meant that they had to pull anti-aircraft weapons, particularly 88mm guns, which were really good anti-tank weapons, so were the Germans' best weapon in the war. Many of these had to be redeployed to cities to shoot at bombers. And it also meant then that because the Germans were committed to defending their cities, that when the Americans eventually got fighters that could fly over Germany, they would attach fuel tanks to P-43s. It meant that the Americans could commit the Germans to an air war in 1944. It meant that the German Air Force had to fight the Americans to defend the cities, and they were able to destroy the German Air Force effectively in 1944, and that led the way to D-Day. D-Day could not happen until the Allies had destroyed the German Air Force or reduced it to an extent that they could get their ships across the Channel. So whether the air war was actually worth it or not is difficult to tell, but it did make Hitler look extremely weak. Hitler could not even protect his own people against British and American bombers, so it made Hitler look less and less like an all-powerful leader. And as battles began to go against the Germans in Africa and then in Russia, Hitler began to look weaker and weaker still. The Germans really struggled to bring all of the industry that they had conquered in Europe into good effect for their cause. They never were able to unite Europe behind them. They never really tried. Hitler behaved like a conqueror. If he conquered a territory, he felt, well, all your goods and all your services and everything you can provide exists for the German people. That was probably a mistake, because Hitler had conquered a huge amount of industry, but that industry never really worked wholeheartedly for him. Up until 1943, a man called Fritz Todt was told to reorganize the economy for total war. Total war means that every single part of your country is going to war. All your factories, all your workers, everything is going to be involved in fighting the enemy. 1943, Todt died in a plane crash, and a man called Albert Speer took over. Now, he didn't particularly want the job. He was an architect. He was Hitler's chief architect, and Hitler liked him. And that's really why he got the job. Hitler felt he could trust Speer, that Speer knew his place, that Speer wouldn't plot against him. And so Speer took over this job in 1943, and he worked wonders. He was able to produce many more tanks, many more weapons. He was able to streamline the German production machine. He was able to stop the army producing many different types of tanks. The German generals wanted lots of tanks for lots of different types of operation. Speer realised that wasn't a good idea. What mattered were you getting out large numbers of tanks rather than these specialised weapons that you wanted. But the real success was the use of prisoners of war from Russia, France, other places, and effectively using these men as slave labour. They were brought into Germany and were made to work for food effectively and nothing else. And that really revolutionised the German war effort and was able to keep Germany in the war for quite some time. Germans did experience poverty during the war. Rationing was a problem. Now, one of the reasons Germany had surrendered during the First World War was because the Allies had blockaded the ports. Not enough food could get into Germany, and German people began to die not so much of hunger, but as illnesses that were hunger-related. And Hitler was terrified of this happening again. So the Germans put a great deal of effort into rationing effectively, because the British, again, during World War II, even though French ports were open to the Germans, the British Navy did effectively blockade Germany and the continent extremely well. A lot of Germans experienced hunger, but not starvation. Parks and gardens were used to grow vegetables. They suggested having one large meal on a Sunday rather than several meals. But still, shops were forced to put up fake displays. They would put salt in a sort of a salty, watery mix would be used to replicate the look of milk, and these would be put out in shops to make it look as if the shops were full, when in fact they weren't. By 1943, clothes were being produced for soldiers and nobody else. But it really wasn't until 1945 that real shortages of food were experienced. So by 1945, people were only getting about a quarter of a kilogram of meat every week, which isn't particularly healthy, and that was down from 700 grams in 1940. At the same time, when Russian soldiers invaded Germany in 1944 through into 1945 and began to see German farms for the first time, they were completely taken aback at how good German farms were, at how much food the German people had. And this was during the worst rationing in Germany. Russians were completely surprised, completely taken aback by how much the ordinary German person had, and that created real anger in the Russian army. The Russian army committed many, many atrocities when it invaded Germany, and part of the reason was the Germans had committed so many atrocities in Russia themselves, but this was an extremely rich nation by comparison to Russia. The Russian soldiers wondered, why on earth would the Germans do this to us when they have so much in their farms? Another effect on the German people were the labour shortages. From 1943, women aged between 17 and 45 were required to work outside home. They were required to work other than at home. So they would have to go out and work in factories. They would have to replace the men who were being called up to serve in the army. They were never really recruited for the army. The Russians did recruit large numbers of women. There were many Russian military police who were women. Russian anti-aircraft batteries were manned by women a lot of the time. Hitler refused to do that. He was worried about the effect this would have on civilian morale. He didn't want people to feel that their wives and daughters were fighting to keep the country free. But by 1944, 40% of women had jobs. And this was the same regime which had said that women should be at home with Kinderkirche Küche, church children cooking. That's what women are for. 40% of women were working by the end of the war. This didn't make up, though, for the number of men that had to go out to fight. And as I have mentioned, the number of missing workers was actually made up from slave labour. There was opposition to Hitler, but none of it was particularly effective. Those who were most likely to have an impact, who were most likely to get rid of Hitler, were the generals. A number of generals and conservative politicians, particularly Roman Catholics, didn't like Hitler, and they plotted against him. There were a large number of attempts on Hitler's life during the war. Most of those attempts never really had any chance of being successful because Hitler was paranoid. He continually changed his travel timetable. He would never really let people know exactly where he was going to be at what time, and therefore it was extremely difficult to plot an assassination. And that probably saved his life. The most famous attempt on Hitler's life, and the most effective, was the von Stauffenberg plot on the 20th of July 1944. Stauffenberg was a colonel in the German army who planted a bomb beside Hitler. He left the room, unfortunately. He wasn't there to see the bomb go off. It wasn't a suicide attack. A suicide attack would have had the best chance of success, obviously. But it meant that he hadn't the bomb placed close enough to Hitler. The bomb did not kill Hitler. Von Stauffenberg and the other plotters had attempted to take over Berlin and other key areas like Paris and to basically get rid of the Nazi leadership very quickly. But their plan really depended on Hitler being dead. Now, that was, in one sense, a very good plan, because if you removed Hitler, he was the centre of Nazi power and you had a much better chance of taking over. But on the other hand, they did not move quickly enough. They did not destroy communication centres quickly enough, and they were very quickly wiped out. The church was probably the next most powerful institution to stand against Hitler, but they only did it in limited areas. So the Roman Catholic Church opposed Hitler's euthanasia program. Hitler, early in the war, had launched a program called Action T4, and that was a program used to get rid of the mentally ill, people with disabilities. Some were injected with poisons, some were gassed using Zyklon B, which was used in Auschwitz eventually to gas Jewish people. Some were starved to death. And when the Catholic Church found out about this, it publicised it, it preached against it, and in 1941 the Germans backed down. That looks like a success of the Roman Catholic Church, but what we now know is that Action T4, that programme killed about 20,000 people, and that's pretty much what the Nazis had intended to do. It achieved everything that the Nazis had wanted, so they basically let it run its course and then looked as if they were backing down to the Roman Catholic Church. There were a lot of priests who ended up in concentration camps. Some priests did hide the Jews, or who were being persecuted in Germany. There was also a Protestant church, a confessional Protestant church, which opposed the National Reich Church, which was under the state control. They believed that the state should not control the church. Some, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a famous German theologian, was involved in the plot to kill Hitler. Others, like Pastor Martin Niemöller, would end up in concentration camps, and he was very lucky to survive the war. But these churchmen were opposed to Nazi control of the church. The Roman Catholic Church was opposed to the Nazi policy of euthanasia, of killing the disabled. They weren't opposed to Nazism per se. They were not out to completely destroy the Nazi state. They were happy enough to go along with it to some extent until we got towards the end of the war, when a few men like Bonhoeffer began to lump themselves in with the army who were plotting against Hitler. The question is, well, why was there not a strong movement to get rid of Hitler, particularly when things began to go badly wrong? When the Russians started to defeat Hitler, when the Americans and the British were bombing German cities and were getting ready to invade Europe, when the British and American forces landed in D-Day, why did the people not oppose Hitler? Well, the Russian army committed many, many atrocities, mass murder on an unimaginable scale in Russia. And German soldiers took photographs of this, sent the photographs back home, they wrote letters back home. And it's an interesting question, why did the German Gestapo, why did the German secret police not stop people publicising these massacres back in Germany? There's a very simple answer. The ordinary Germans realised that the German army had massacred men, women and children in Russia, and had done so on a massive scale, and had destroyed Russian cities. And they knew that Russia was run by a dictator called Stalin. So they knew that if they lost the war against Russia, Russian soldiers would end up in Germany and they would have their revenge. And that really tied the German people to Hitler. They had to fight against Russia. They had to stick with Hitler in his campaign against Russia because the Russians were coming and they were going to have their revenge. And there was nothing anyone could do about that. They were now locked with Hitler in a fight to the bitter end against Russia. The German generals really rebelled against Hitler because they realized the war against Russia was going to be lost. Hitler was making disastrous decisions, and their hope was that they could stop the Russians in the east and then negotiate with Britain and America and come to a deal that would end the war with Britain and America, and then maybe they could defend themselves against Russia. That was very unlikely to happen. The Britons and the Americans had agreed with Russia that the Germans would have to surrender unconditionally. The Germans would be no conditions to the German surrender, and they were never going to break ranks with Russia. But that's why opposition to Hitler never really took off, and it wouldn't take off in the church either, because Stalin and the communist government had persecuted the church ferociously. So if the churches had opposed Hitler effectively and got rid of Hitler, well, then that could lead to a Russian victory and massive persecution of Christians in Germany. So it was always going to be very difficult to get effective opposition to Hitler. There were other groups small groups that opposed Hitler. Young people, there was a small group called the White Rose that was run by Sophie and Hans Scholl, and they were a student movement which produced leaflets. Other resistance came from groups like the Kreishaus Circle. Now, the Kreishaus Circle was simply a group of anti-Nazi intellectuals, former politicians, who met and discussed how Germany should be run when the Nazis were defeated. They didn't really have any plan to oppose Hitler, and in any case they were wiped out after the von Stauffenberg plot. There was Jewish resistance to the Nazis, but that was really an attempt to survive against what was the alternative was certain elimination. So in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, about 300 Germans were killed, but the Jewish people who fought there were completely wiped out, almost to a man. In Treblinka and Sobibor, the Sonderkommando, who were the Jews who were forced to work the death camps, they rebelled against the Nazis. Again, they were nearly wiped out, although some did escape. In Germany, some non-Jewish women had married Jewish men, and they protested when the Nazis tried to send their men away from Germany, and that saved their husbands' lives. But the only real effective resistance that the Jews could provide was to flee. There were attempts to get Jews out of Germany from the death camps to Europe. That had a little bit of an impact on American and British policy, but they did very little to directly save the Jews. They never bombed Auschwitz, for example. One reason for that was that the Americans and the British didn't want to make it look as if it was all a Jewish plot against Hitler. They didn't want to make it look as if the Jews controlled American and British policy. Another reason was they simply couldn't believe the stories. They found it very difficult to get their heads around the scale of Hitler's plot to eliminate the Jews. But German resistance against Hitler was very weak, partly to do with German propaganda, partly to do with the Gestapo's control over German society, but mainly to do with the fact that once Germany was committed to a really vicious and bloodthirsty war in Russia, the German people were really caught on a bond with Hitler. They really had no way out because they knew that the Russians, if they defeated the German army, would get into Germany and have their revenge.